Hi, everybody, and welcome to another professional development session. I am Prue Gonzalez, and I am here with Lachlan, Kalache, playing some fantastic music on our Tuesday morning. So thank you very much for coming along today. Today, we're going to be moving on. So we've spent a few weeks looking at Zoom. We've spent some time thinking about how we might engage our audience. And this time we're moving on to having a look at how we might go about scaffolding feedback of assessment and scaffolding our assessments online with students. So a lot of the things that we'll talk about today, you can implement straight away into your subject, even though we're a few weeks in now to teaching. And there might be other things that you'll take with you as we go into other sessions of study. Today, most importantly, we are joined by some experts. So we are joined by the wonderful Wouter Kalle. We will be joined by Kirsten Locke, and also Kim Bailey is here as well. So they'll be taking us through some of their expert tips and insider knowledge from some of the different things they'll do with students around scaffolding of feedback and assessments online. So we do have quite a few things to get through today. And as always, we'll do our absolute best to make our way through all of them. But very briefly, we'll run through things like types of feedback, a little bit about creating feedback, and some information around feedback structure. We'll also look at some examples and then think about, well, how can we make feedback consistent? Why would we want to do that? What would be the meaning behind that? How we might go about supporting our students, and as always, our top tips as well. So there's quite a lot for us to get through. I thought we'd start today, though, by a quick question to have a think about for you all. So when it comes to feedback, have you ever had some feedback yourself and not really known what to do with it? So maybe you've had some feedback that just made you angry. Was it reviewer number 2 on that journal article that you sent in? There's always something that we're not sure about with feedback. So it's really important to have a think about some feedback we've received and then take with us and flip that around to how students might perceive our feedback. So we do know that feedback is really important. We know that it's a central aspect of that assessment process that we do at university. We also know it can have a significant impact on how students develop their learning in our subjects and what they'll take with them beyond that. Feedback is great, but it only works if we actually engage with it. So we always want students to be reading our feedback and then doing something with that. So when we come to university, I guess there's, well, in general, 2 different types of feedback, and hopefully this will ring some bells for each of you. We might implement these as we go, but there's formative feedback. So this is what we might have in mind around that constructive type of feedback to students. It's used to improve their learning and our teaching, and it really does occur during learning. So their students are able to act upon the feedback that we give them. It tends to not be punitive, but it's really about that around the quality of the feedback that we provide. There's also what we might consider the summative feedback, and this is also something that sort of drives learning at university. It's the final judgment on a student achievement. So at university, this is usually in the form of an end of session exam or an essay or a report, and it's a judgment, and it's used to check learning at the end of that sort of teaching episode, in our case, our sessions. What you might find, though, is that most pieces or most assessments that students do at university are usually a mixture. They have formative and summative elements. So a good example would be when comments are offered alongside a final mark on an assignment. So you might find you're using a bit of a mix of these. When we create the feedback as well, very briefly, there's different ways we can do this. And I think that most of you will be using a range of these as we go through. So there's the informal feedback, and that can occur at any time. Usually emerges spontaneously in class, perhaps, or in an email to a student, usually during the action, during the moment. We also have that very formal feedback planned and scheduled into the process. And it might be around also providing marks to students. It might be something that we record in Grade Centre as well. We have the traditional type of assessment feedback, and this might be our face-to-face discussions with students in class or online. It might be our written comments. It might be using Norfolk or inline track changes and annotations in that very traditional way. But we also know we've got a whole other range of ways that we can provide feedback to students, and it might be multimodal, which we'll receive some information on in a moment. So it might be around audio or video, perhaps, or even screencasts. It could be automatic feedback via test centre, multiple choice questions, short answer, and it could also be around looking at different types of audiences. Is it individual feedback? Is it group feedback? Is it class feedback? So there's lots of different ways we can create feedback, different types of feedback for different types of purposes. So I guess at this point, as we're moving along, have a think about what your feedback tips are as well, and what perhaps what you'd like to learn more about in this session, and pop them into that chat box as we're going through today. So we do have 3 experts with us today who'll take us through different examples of how they structure and scaffold their assessment and feedback for students. So pop some questions you might have. Now is a great opportunity to pose those questions and have some expert feedback on them yourselves. So the very first person that we have today is Wouter Kalle. So Wouter is from the School of Biomedical Sciences, and I've just got to check my fact sheet. Wouter, I think you're a lecturer in biomedical sciences.
In molecular biology officially, but I'm happy with either. Yeah.
That is very official, Wouter, very official indeed. And Wouter's here very quickly because he's so kind as to give up his time. He is meant to be in class at the moment lecturing, but he's given up his time to talk a little bit about something I'm very keen to hear more about, which is audio-based feedback. So Wouter, if you'd like to, you're more than welcome to share your screen and sort of take us through how you use feedback and why you perhaps went to audio and what you think the benefits might be.
Yeah, okay, thanks Prue for that introduction. I'm not sure where my video points at. I'm in the lecture theatre, so it's all a bit crappy. So I'm just going to share my screen, which usually takes me hours. There we go. So this is a presentation I did in 2019. It's a long time ago, eh? For the faculty workshop, and if you look at the little page that I made, that's usually what my feedback used to look like 10 years ago, you know, with lots of marks on it and absolutely unintelligible for any students. So that's about 8 years ago. I read some papers about people doing audio feedback, and I thought that was a really nice way. I did some experiments with giving short audio files instead of full lectures on CDs that I've done somewhere really early on in my career, which seemed to have very good feedback from the students. So I thought, oh yeah, let me just talk. So I tried to set up a system, and you know, everyone works in their own way with computers. I find it very interesting how I do things very differently from someone else in the apps that I use and how I save things, but it works for me. So don't challenge the method. The method is for everyone different. Everyone has their own way of working with their files and all that stuff. It's more like the idea. So if I go, I just wanted to show not every slide here because that would be terrible. So basically, what I did, I set up a system where I have 2 subjects or 3 subjects actually for written assignments. They're 1,500 to 300,000 words. They're not real essays. They're more like very brief lit reviews. I think that's the best description. There was a rubric attached to that in subject outline, and different topics, different sessions, etc., etc. So I use a recording app that I have on my Apple at home, which didn't cost me a cent and is very easy to use. Other people use Norfolk. You can use whatever. You can use Word. You can use whatever you feel like. I set it up like this, so that's how I keep on using it. So what I will do is read through the assignment, and actually, having in mind that I had to say something about it, I actually read it carefully instead of being very, very quick. And then I would highlight things in different colors. You can only do that in Word. You can't do that in PDF, at least not in my version of PDF. So I had a Word file, highlight different colors, and then I know what to say about something. Students knew what the colors meant in the sense that a red color means that I talk about a general comment that I explain in the audio file. Yellow means there's a content issue, light blue, a typo or a reference issue, etc. So they have that little list of colors as well. Then I open my app and I start recording, and I always start with the same thing. And as soon as I start saying it, you see my eyes glaze over because I go in. I've done about, I don't know, 2,000 of these assignments now. So I start glazing over straight away. So I won't pronounce it, but basically I have the same sentence all the time. Talk about the rubric that I copied in front of the text and that I blocked out the levels they've attained, and I say which mark they have. And nowadays I say a high distinction or credit or pass or fail level mark, because sometimes I change the mark afterwards and then I have to do the whole thing again. So that just saves time. And then I generally go through it at the highlight points, I make a remark, whether that's positive or negative, that depends a little bit, but I'm generally a very positive person in those audio files. And I explain the highlights. So I explain what they did well, and I explain where I think they should work on. And then summarize and give a positive remark that that I'm looking forward to seeing more of their writing. So that's sort of in a nutshell. File is depends on the size of and the quality of the assignment. If it's a really good one, the file can be 1 minute. And then basically I just give a big sigh and I say, well, what can I say? If it's a really bad one, it can take up to 8 minutes. If it's a 3,000 word assignment, it's usually, even a good one takes about 2 to 3 minutes. But I tend to don't take less time or more time than marking on paper. I think it's equivalent, I would say. So if we just go through a few numbers, and I'm not going to explain this whole slide, but basically, if you look at the last point, that the feedback that I received throughout the subject helped me learn effectively, which is one of our student evaluation questions, that significantly changed over the years. So that went from 0.78 to 0.87, and the school mean went up a little bit as well, but not as much. The timely feedback went up as well, but I think that's my gut feeling at least, and I can't prove that really. I think because they got really good feedback, they think it's on time as well. They're quite happy with the feedback, and I am very quick. I tend to do everything within 2 weeks. So those two things together, the quality of the feedback plus the timeline of the feedback was really what helped there. Let me see if there's another one. Yeah. So these are some comments that I had, and you can read through them. But basically, the comments are 99.999% very positive. Students like it; they feel connected, and especially like last year with this whole COVID business, some people might remember that. And we all did everything online, and students really enjoyed it. That they heard me talk, and especially external students, they find that connection quite nice. And that's one of the things as well that is in the literature, that you get a connection. So what I'm focusing now on is this all is sort of old hat for me. So I do that automatically almost. And now I'm going to look into more ways of giving a bit of feed forward to talk about the next assignment. Because most of these assignments are done in my subjects. It's second year, first session, second year, second session, third year, second session. So there is a bit of progression for the students. With the microsession model, I would have to really look at that model to see how that progression works for my subjects. But basically, we have a progression of assignments as well. So I'm trying to tell them how they can improve as well in their writing, and also in the setup of the assignment. So some of them are really, I'm a scatterbrain myself, so I recognize it straight away. Some of them are really scattered in their assignments. Some of them have really poor English, and I'm a second language speaker myself, so I recognize that as well. And because I'm a second language speaker, I can give them a comment about it as well. So I advise them to go and talk to the Ellen people, or to seek help from people at university to improve their writing, their English writing. And some of them are just way too talk too much. So they use way too many words to say very simple concepts. And so that feed forward, I think, might help. But I'm not sure how I can test it. That's one thing. And I'm also not sure, because that would be great if you can see that they get better marks afterwards. And I'm just thinking about these kind of things at the moment. But we are now starting with this micro-session model. So I'm running 3 different sessions at the same time, all through each other with 3 different subjects. So my brain is a bit scattered at the moment. Yeah, I think that's it, Prue. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Wouter. I think for many people who haven't tried this, it sounds like you would suggest trialing the use of audio feedback. We definitely have a couple of questions in the chat box around. I'm just going to start and work my way backwards. Lachlan, unless Lachlan, you would like to ask them, we can do the old switcheroo this PD session.
Okay, no problem. I can put on my best Prue voice if you like. It's not going to be that. Speaking of audio feedback. Yeah, okay, so we'll start from the bottom up. I'm interested in how you got the audio file back to the students, given that we can't obviously attach it in places like EASE. How did they get them? Did you just send them a link?
That's a very good question. So I have my system, and I'm actually quite embarrassed because it's a very slow and very tedious system, which has about 2 or 3 points where I can actually check the ones I marked and the ones that have been handed in. So for me, it works really well. But what I do is I send through East the file with the colors and the rubric and the mark, and then I send a general message out when that all gets returned to the students that they will receive an audio file by email, and then I email them all. And I use the email address they use to hand in their assignment. So it's a bit convoluted and complex, and I think it can be much easier if you use not an Apple, that's for one thing, and use Notebook. Yeah.
All right, so we've got some related questions in and around that. Jackie's asking what the file size is like for the audio.
Yep. That can go up to about 5 to 7 meg. And sometimes you get in trouble because like things like Gmail and Hotmail, the student's address might not like it. I constantly get emails from CSU that my inbox or my email box is out of control, and then I just delete them all because I keep them myself as well. Yeah.
Just riffing before I forget this as well, you may want to try using something like the journal tool for submission of the task, because that will mean they can send their document to you, you can mark it up, and you can provide the audio, all of it without having to go near East. So you could do all of that stuff in line without having to deal with individual emails or everything that you're doing currently, you could do within that one tool, including attaching the audio files without having to do that.
I think that would be really nice. And I'm using this convoluted method because that's just how I set it up and I'm comfortable with. It's, we're all conservative at a certain age. So, but I do take that into account. The problem is I do have to send everything back through East. Otherwise the bean counters get on my case that I haven't returned the assignment quickly enough.
Right.
So
yep.
I still have to use East no matter what.
Now, Kim is asking, do you think as a result you had fewer students challenging or appealing their grades because of obviously the quality of the feedback you're providing?
That's a very good question. And I actually don't know because they never appeal their grade.
They never appeal, there you go.
Maybe there's the answer. I don't know. I've had appeals of grade once or twice. Mainly because when I send out a message that says, please listen to your feedback first before you contact me. And sometimes I get within 10 seconds, the marks are out, and within 10 seconds, I get a student calling me like, I've got a way too low marks. I said, well, please listen to your feedback first. So and when they listen, they come back to me and say, okay, that's all fair. But I've had it once that it was a bit, and I think I was a bit too harsh in there in hindsight. Yep.
Right. Okay. Whilst you were presenting as well, I was talking about the fact that as part of the Turnitin tool set, using the grade mark product, which is built in, they have a quick marks tool, which is customizable, which is the equivalent of your color scheme for particular types of feedback, for example, that people can mark up and color the document within Turnitin and use a record radio button in there to record their feedback, all within the submitted Turnitin document, which is a nice sort of holistic integrated way of approaching grading, assessment and feedback. But the big problem we have here at CSU is that we're missing the final integration, which allows the grade, the feedback and everything else to go straight into the grade center. Because if that happened, it meant the students could submit, we could mark, they could get their grades and their feedback all in the one ecosystem. So we're working on it, but that final kind of piece to round that process out is currently missing, and that's obviously part of why people like yourself are looking for solutions that work for them, that can use various tools.
Yeah, I think whatever people start with, they will develop for themselves and make it into a sort of automated, recognizable thing. So, and I'm very aware that I'm doing it very convolutedly. However, what I find quite easy with it is that I have a few internal controls on that I don't miss any assignments, and that I can contact students that haven't handed in, and that the marks are correctly put into Grade Center, that I don't miss any marks. So for me, it works because I'm I'm a bit. I really want to keep an eye on that I've done everything and don't forget anything. Yeah, there's a bit of a perfectionist streak in me, which doesn't really fit with the scatterbrain, but it's yeah. But it works for me, and I'm pretty sure there are like 20 different versions of programs out there that you can use. The only thing is, what I say is it has to go back through East, because otherwise you get in trouble with your head of school.
I think I've got one final question before I hand things back to Prue to keep going, obviously, and that's numbers. What kind of cohort size are we talking about here with the tasks and the feedback?
Yeah. So when I started doing it, there was one cohort of about 75 to 100 students. There was one cohort between 40 and 60, and one cohort of 30. And the 75 to 100 dropped down to about 60 as well. So it's, yeah. But I really, what I do, I block out my whole agenda for the 2 weeks that I'm marking. I only come to university to give lectures, go straight home, and I set it up in blocks. I do about 4 of them, or 3 if they're really long. Some, because after that your brain is moose. After the 4, I go and have a walk in the garden, or pet my dog or whatever, and then I do another 4, and then I have a really good break with coffee, lunch, whatever, and then I do maximum another 8, so maximum 16 a day, because otherwise you really your marking quality goes really down, I found. Yeah. So that's how I set it up, because it works for me. And I see it as the main thing, apparently teaching is the core business of the university. You wouldn't know it sometimes, but so I see that is my main goal for those 2 weeks. And I'm lucky they don't come at the same time.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Look, I think I'll just speak on behalf of everyone here and say thank you for taking some time out from your teaching schedule this morning, Wouter. That's really good of you to share your practice. And
they're
Prue,
already coming in here. I told them to come half an hour late, but they're already coming in. So I really have to vamoose. Sorry about that.
No, thank you very much.
Thank you for asking me, and thank you for the introduction and all that kind of stuff. Thank you.
Thanks for sharing.
Wouter.
Talk to you later.
That's excellent. So I think we've got some great tips from Wouter on how we might like to think about using audio feedback. And Wouter talked about his different types of class sizes and how long it takes him. And I think they're all questions we have when we're looking at marking and providing feedback to our students. Our next special guest is Kirsten Locke. We're lucky enough to have Kirsten with us. And Kirsten has some interesting cohorts. So Kirsten does have very large cohorts of students. Kirsten is a lecturer in Indigenous Australian Studies from the School of Indigenous Australian Studies. And we've asked Kirsten to come along just to talk about how you work with providing feedback to very large group numbers, how you might go about that, and what that might look like as well. So thank you, Kirsten, for coming along.
Thanks, Prue. I'll just share my screen.
Great.
Okay, so this is one of my grade centres, and obviously I've hidden the surname and student number there. And although most of the subjects I teach or convene are really large, up to 600 or 700 students, just as an example, this is a small one just because you get a better visual. So in our school, we use the Grade Centre not just for recording marks, but for providing feedback and for getting, I suppose, a complete picture of the student experience, or as complete as possible in a really large cohort of the student experience through the subject. So I'll just get my trusty little annotate tool here. So this here and here and here, these 3 columns, they're tests within Blackboard Interact, but they're not tests that have any marks that go towards them. They're just little tests that I put in there for students. For example, the terminology is to self-test, the terminology they might use when writing about Indigenous people in Australia. And then when we're marking that their assessment task, we can see whether or not they have completed that terminology quiz and give our feedback according to that. So for example, if they did the quiz, they went really well, but then didn't apply it into their written work, then we would be, our feedback would be around application. If they hadn't, so these students here who haven't done it, if there was an issue with their terminology, we might say, remember that there are terminology resources and a terminology quiz, so make sure you do that before your main assessment task. This one, annotate a key source here. I put that one in just this session because last session there was one particular element of the major assessment task which students struggled with, and it was because they hadn't accessed a particular source. So it's in there as a test, but it's mostly for me to be able to see who has and who hasn't annotated that source as we're leading into assessment 2, because then I can just use the grade center and, for example, I'll just take it off. I'll clear that actually for now. I can, for example, email the students through here who haven't annotated the source yet and remind them, don't forget to annotate that source because it's going to be really important for assessment 2. Then there's another little test, which is assessment 2 readiness, and it's just one question, which is, are you feeling confident about submitting assessment 2? So if they answer no, then the answer, I guess, to that is, okay, well, here are some things you can do. You can contact the subject coordinator. You can make sure you have completed this particular learning activity. You can post on the discussion board to get clarification. You can come to class, a range of different things, whatever it is. And if they say yes, it says, great job. Remember, you can clarify, you know, in a range of different ways. Then what I do is, again, using email here, and obviously it's really early in the session, so you know, there'll be lots of students with the no and the yes, and I use color coding just to make it super quick and easy for myself. I'll email them and say, I've noticed that you're not feeling confident about submitting assessment 2, so here's some things you can do, just email me back, whatever it is. And the same to affirm the experiences of students who are feeling confident, then I can email them. And because it's just one email, it's not very time consuming. So it's like a 2-minute job. And then I usually get emails back from students. They're grateful that someone's touched base with them, and we go from there. So I use those triggers through the grade center. In my large classes, for example, oh no, actually I haven't, oh yes, I have. I thought I hadn't hidden things. This is, no, I'm going to use a different one. No, I don't know where it is. I didn't cape it. Okay. So in my large classes, there's, for example, in one, there's 15 markers. And so we have columns around, so I can, the markers write in which paper they mark. They can flag tasks for moderation, like these ones are. And then I will write whether I agree or disagree with the moderation in there. So Prue, I'm not sure whether you wanted me to talk about moderation now or not.
Yeah, absolutely, Kirsten. I think while you're in the grade centre, it would be great to hear a bit more about how you moderate in these large cohorts. Absolutely.
Yeah, okay. So I guess it's a, I'm just going to go straight in. I guess it's a pretty holistic sort of setup, the way we have it. So we have an organisational site for that we work with our sessional markers on. And for example, here's a big cohort. This has 15 different markers here. So we complete moderation here. So I kind of set the scene. Here's the moderation activity we're going to do. Everything's de-identified on here. Here's the rubric. We used Cadmus, so just some little videos. I let them know that they can watch the assessment 1 video that I prepared for students too. So that's a way that we can get consistency across, you know, 500 or 700 students. The markers can ask questions and then they upload their moderation. It scrolls down a bit. And then after people have done that, the moderation conversation starts. So people talk about, you know, why they gave that activity a certain mark, their rationale for that. If there's, for example, in this group, we were all really close between 6.5 and 7, and there was one outlier who said, I think I got really excited and gave it a 9 because she was excited about marking again. So we have that conversation, and then because we're marking in Cadmus at the moment, then we can all see each other's marking. And so if one marker wanted to see a 9 or a 10, then he just looks through to find one that's been graded as a 9 or 10, and he can see that too. And then I'll have a conversation about, and this isn't just something I do in my school, we all use this in our school, which sort of sets the tone, because in a really large cohort, tone is really important, and I want the way I teach to then be reflected in the feedback students get from marking. So I don't want them to have one thing in class or in emails to me and then something totally different from a marker. And with 15 markers, that can be tricky. So this is, that's how we do that. I think that's probably all. I've just sped through that.
This is really great, Kirsten. So, and sorry, I might have missed it here, but the site that you're sitting in now, is this an org site, or are you actually still within the subject site?
No, this is an org site. So in our school, we have one org site where, I'll just go back, with a separate forum for each subject we're teaching in that session, and then we hide them after that. So that was the IKC 101 org site, and I'm also teaching IKC 100. So the markers know just to go to the forum that they're working in at that time.
Excellent. That's fantastic.
But you could just set up, I was talking with someone in nursing last week and showed her this, and she set up an org site just for her markers.
Excellent. It's always nice to have a window into another academic or another school or another discipline's way of doing something that we might not have thought of before. Lachlan, have there been any discussions going on in the chat box?
Yeah, but in a lot of cases, people answering the other questions that are going in, which is handy as well. Obviously, the curly one's about resourcing and who's paid to do what, etc. in this environment. But
and our markers are paid for moderation. And so this would be the way I use it. And there's slight differences the way people in our school use it, but the way I use it, this is instead of, say, a pre-moderation meeting. They complete that 5 hours on the sessional hub.
That's a really interesting idea. Also makes me think that maybe kind of recording that sort of process, Prue, might be something that others might be interested in at some point, if they were going to set up their own school-based hub for moderation as well.
It's good PD for sessional staff, because it gets them really comfortable working in an online space, and all of our teaching is online in our school, except for, we have a little bit of face-to-face, but the majority of work that our sessional work in are online. And so over time, markers can come in and feel a bit lost. And then I'll show you an example here of quite a new marker. I think it was in this one. Okay, so a marker can ask a question there about, that's just something new we're using. But Michelle here said she was having trouble getting her allocated students, and Peter's only been a marker for a really short while, but he then steps in and, markers kind of get that confidence to work together and support each other. And so that, because they truly are a crucial part of our team, and we want them to be really well supported in their work, because the outcome of that is students are getting really consistent feedback. That's the aim. With 700 students, it's not going to be hiccup free, but we aim for consistent with a consistent tone, and yeah.
And I suppose the last thing I'd ask, Kirsten, is to what extent does this connect to, I guess, your institutional processes? I'm thinking along the lines of Quasar here, and what's happening in the org site versus that, you know, business end of the deal.
Yep. So there's really strong links, you know, in Quasar, how they ask how many tasks were moderated. So again, this is, I think, my small, oh no, this one isn't, but the marking's only just started for this task. But I can use the grade center here to see how many tasks have been moderated and what changes are made. So if something stays the same, I just write it's moderated. And if there's a change, it's transparent in the grade center. The other thing is, if a student emailed and said, I'm not happy with my marking, with my mark, then I just work all day with my grade centers open, because they are such big classes. And I can see, okay, well, that one was actually moderated. So the advice I'll give that student is different to one that I might take a look at if it wasn't moderated. So if it was moderated, I might say there's a formal review of mark process. Here's the information. If it wasn't moderated, then I could say I'll take a look at that, because, you know, we all know that things can happen sometimes, especially with those student numbers. So it sort of helps me to get a really clear picture really fast of what's happening with the student.
Yeah, it's quite holistic as well, I suppose. It shows their progression over the entire subject rather than just snapshot. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Thank you, Prue. I think we might hand that back to you to keep the wheels turning. But as with Wouter, thank you so much for sharing your time with us, Kirsten, and your approaches to this.
Pleasure.
If we get any other questions coming through, I'm sure we'll send those along.
Yeah, thank you very much, Kirsten. That's really fantastic. As we are moving along, we are joined by our next expert for today, the wonderful Kim Bailey, who is a lecturer in law from the Centre for Justice Studies. I think I'm going to say, Kim, I feel like it changes, or I just forget what name it's called.
No, that's okay. Centre for Law and Justice. Close.
Excellent. I was close. So Kim is joining us today to talk about how she would go about scaffolding her assessments and her feedback again. So very different examples this time, but following on in the same vein as Wouter and Kirsten as well. So thank you very much for coming along, Kim.
Oh, you're welcome. I certainly don't like being called an expert, because I think the only thing I'm good at is trying, failing, and then recalibrating. So that tends to be how you find what works. I've learned a lot this morning, so thank you to my colleagues. I guess I would show you more some of the different forms of feedback that we've been giving students in law. We are getting increasingly large cohorts in law, and so we're having to recalibrate how we do feedback and how we feed forward as well. So it's been an interesting journey, but I'll just share my screen with you and show you a couple of examples. Sorry, actually, I need to share my sound with you as well. Okay, so hopefully you can see there the assessment feedback. So this is a subject site. It's not actually a current subject site, but it's an example that I've pulled up for you. We had a number of assessments in this subject. It's a first year law subject. It tends to be what I would call boot camp for law students, this subject, because there's a lot of information, a lot of reading, and a lot of legal writing. So it's a real coalescence of a lot of skills that we're requiring from the students, and they're very keen to get our feedback early on. Students' papers are generally marked and dealt with via EASE. We do have in some of our subjects oral assessments, interactive oral assessments with students, which is really interesting and really helpful in terms of their formative development as well. In this subject, short, concise assessment tasks with a variety of text types that emulate what they will need to do in legal practice is generally the way we go for the first year subject. The student receives their feedback via EASE with the marking rubric highlighted, comments of what they did positively, what they need to focus on to improve, and it's commented throughout the document as a Word document, pointing to different places where we're exemplifying the feedback that we're giving them. Yes, it's time consuming, but I find for first year subjects, if you take that time, you're going to end up with a better student by third year, and you're actually building their study skills, which is really important. Once we've done that, often what I'll do is prepare a Panopto video, such as the one you can see on the screen, that's a whole cohort feedback, because a lot of students actually want to know how they've gone in terms of how their peers are tracking, particularly because they're all online learners in law and they don't get to see each other over coffee and say, well, what did you get in your assessment? Albeit that they do chat on social media and we know that. So I just thought I'd share with you an example of what that looks like. Thinking about scenarios and applying tortious principles, you had to, sorry, we'll go back to the start. 19.25, very high. Our lowest mark was 0. Various reasons for that, mainly that it wasn't attempted. The average mark though, which is what you're probably wondering, is how did you go compared to your peers? 12.67. So if you were around that mark, you should be pleased. It means you're tracking okay. Some people did very well and answered very clearly and very well. And on the whole, I actually was really happy with the response to this assessment. So that's giving them whole cohort feedback in terms of just the grades. And then later in the video, what I'll do is actually show them, because this was an online short answer quiz. So they actually had to identify a particular legal cause of action and support that with relevant authority. And so I then would give them feedback as a cohort again on their collective strengths and collective weaknesses, building forward to what they're going to do in their next assessment task, because the ability to be succinct, to provide authority for what they're doing, builds into assessment 2. So I could give them this whole cohort feedback through a short Panopto video. It doesn't take long to record. And I find that and also too, we can track how frequently the students are looking at this, and it was very popular for students in that subject. So that was one form of feedback. Another way that we are looking at feed forward and feedback as well, because it really is a continuous loop for us, I suppose, in terms of building core competency and skills, which I'll share with you, are assessment folders and information. So in this subject, which is currently running at the moment, we have a very large cohort, which is great, but at the same time quite wily to manage. We organise our assessments into assessment folders so that the student has a one-stop place where they go if they have any information or questions they want on that assessment task. So if we jump into that folder, we've got a Padlet wall there, which is scrolling, with information for the students where they can post any questions that they'd like. They can comment on each other's questions. They can provide information and share information when they're building towards assessment. So although this isn't feedback, it is actually really important in terms of giving them information and helping them to resolve any problems they might have, particularly because we're so compressed for time in tutorials. So you'll see here that the students have been posting to each other. Where do I find that legislation? How do I interpret this legislation? Does this cover New South Wales? And they're responding to each other, which is really exciting. So the peer-to-peer learning that's going on in assessment here is really encouraging. And I'm wading in when appropriate, but generally letting them go here, because I think it's actually really helpful that they're collaborating with each other, just making sure that I actually qualify things. Now, what I then did was that I collated the information on the questions of assessment that I was getting from students from email, I also have the discussion board going, which is not having as much traffic as the Padlet wall, but nonetheless, that's another forum. And from here, and I did a very short 5-minute podcast on Anchor FM on your frequently asked questions about assessment 1. And I said to them things that I hadn't even thought of. They had asked me, which were really helpful. So I then went through and explained to them and answered their questions. That some people were wondering X, this is how I would approach it. Some people were wondering what it should look like, whether you need a bibliography. Yes, you do. And so forth. So that took all of 5 minutes because it's just an audio file. I embedded that on the Padlet wall, and so that's there as well, which was really helpful. So that way of getting that dialogue between the students and working out what they're wondering about assessment and giving them constructive information about how best to to submit their assessment task. Another aspect that I'd show you as well that we're trialling in law and we're really excited about are study groups in our subject sites. This was born out of the idea that with a cohort of, approximately 120 law students, all of who like to talk a lot, managing them in tutorials, even when we've split them into 2 tutorials, is really difficult to give them the time and the attention that they need in preparing for assessment. So what we've done is that we have created these online study groups because, again, they're online learners, where they opt in to the study group themselves. It's not compulsory, and we probably get about 40% take up, we're finding, in most law subjects. They self-assign into the group. It's a tool in Interact 2, and within their group, they've actually got a file exchange, and I encourage them with scaffolded information to assist them, ideas on how they could exchange files helpfully. So for example, Google Documents, a working Google document table that's got the relevant legislative provisions and how they can apply it, preparing towards their exam, so adding to that as a group. We suggest to them as well that they set up regular Zoom meetings between each other. Some of them are meeting on WhatsApp, they're talking on Facebook, they're exchanging information in the ways that they want to exchange it. They've got the group email tool. They've also got their own group discussion board where often they'll post their meeting information of what they're going to be doing as their own group. Now, I don't tend to wade into these unless I'm asked to, or unless at first instance when I can see that they've opted in, but they don't quite know how to get started. So we scaffold that with a lot of information of, great, you've joined a group. Now here's some suggestions on how you can work towards your assessment. One of the things that I've found is really critical with this is you need to be very explicit as an academic about what an appropriate use of these groups is and what's an inappropriate use of the groups in terms of assessment. Because the students were really worried about collusion and whether this was a tool for collusion and they were going to get in trouble for actually meeting together to discuss the assessment. So I've had to be quite explicit, and it's different. I guess the answer, if you look at the definition of collusion in the student misconduct rule, it depends very much on the nature of the task and also on the academics instructions that surround that task. So I will say to them quite explicitly, I want you to use your groups for assessments 1, 2, and 3. I do not want you to use your groups except in this limited capacity for assessment 4. This is what collusion does look like, i.e. actually writing an answer and sharing that answer with another student, as against discussing, debating, collaborating on the legal principles and then going away and writing it yourself. So we're finding less academic misconduct issues by using this tool. We're finding students are feeling much better supported for assessment by using this tool. And we're finding that the online learner isolation has also been dramatically reduced by using this tool. I've had some really beautiful emails from students that probably would have dropped out had they not joined a study group. So just a thought, if you've got online learners, it's something that we've been really excited about and seems to be working well, particularly for assessment preparation and showing them explicitly how they can use this to up the ante on their assessment preparation. I'm not sure if there's much else that I can share with you for now, apart from the other thing that we have tried in terms of feedback is the oral feedback in the Viva Voce interactive oral assessment. That I'd also encourage you to think about experimenting with because it's instantaneous. And interestingly, we've found that when we give students a factual scenario, they then prepare a document based on that scenario. And then I discuss their response, their written response with them in an interactive 15-minute assessment. And it's a wonderful profession ready tool that students have. But the good thing about the feedback is that it's instantaneous. And they have the recording of that through Zoom. They have their own private Zoom link that's not being shared with other students that they can review the feedback. And then they can review my comments in light of what their own performance is when they review that subsequently in their own time. And I found that really interesting. Students really like it. And we also find that they never seem to question their marks when we do it that way, interestingly. So, because I guess they can see themselves how they've performed and they can gauge your response. So I think that's probably all I wanted to share.
Excellent tips there. Thank you, Kim. One question I very quickly have was with your study groups, because to me they sound really exciting. Do you have a proportion of students who don't sign up to a study group?
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's the thing, to make it explicit that it's an optional tool, but that it's a tool that's going to help them. And I actually put in the instructions some academic material about how learning collaboratively is a profession ready attribute, but also helps you succeed academically. So I try and give them good reasons for it. But I have students, for example, that have PTSD that just can't function in a group forum like this. And that's fine. So it's up to them. They're still supported with the same amount of information, but I do find the students who are in these study groups tend to perform better. And it's interesting because the students will communicate with me on assessment and will say, look, you spoke to us about vicarious liability, but we're just not clear on that. And we're really worried about it for the exam. Will you come to our Zoom meeting and have a chat with us about that? So I'm dealing with 8 to 10 students at once on a particular issue rather than one email at a time. So it's a really big win.
Excellent. Yeah, I'll be keen to hear how that progresses and how it keeps evolving in some of your subjects as well.
Yeah, the other interesting thing I'll just add to that as well is that they provide the study groups as a starting point for the students, obviously, to encourage them to draw on each other's knowledge and experience as well as part of learning. But the first thing that we notice as well is that almost immediately within the study tools, they're establishing other ways to interact with one another. So you find that they set up WhatsApp groups almost immediately. So they've got a private kind of a network that they're using, and or in other kind of mediums like Facebook, for example. So we know that students will use those other tools, but by providing the study group structure initially, at least, it tends to encourage more of them to be thinking along those lines, I think. Has that been your experience as well, Kim?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's right. And making sure you're available is really critical. But at the same time, also being quite explicit with them that I am not moderating this forum. However, if it comes to my attention that something disrespectful or unhelpful is going on, I will get involved. But generally, this is your forum. My forum where I'm moderating is the discussion board and your Padlet stream in the assessment folder. So it's really their space to communicate, and that's been very positive.
No, that sounds excellent. Thank you, Kim. I think, again, really great examples, everyone that we've had today talking about different ways of scaffolding feedback and assessment, and particularly looking at the different scales. We've had examples from smallish subjects, not entirely small, to quite large, from individual feedback to group feedback, and in completely different mediums. And I think some of the comments that Wouter made, and I think it's quite similar to Kim and Kirsten as well, is that it's almost finding what works best for you and your students within your subject, having a think about what it is that you're trying to provide them and what that could possibly look like and how you might provide that feedback. So some really, really great examples there. So I guess, so thank you again. So thank you, Kirsten, Wouter and Kim. We really do appreciate you coming along and sharing your experiences with us. I guess wrapping it up today, we'll just go through some really quick and brief sort of discussion around feedback structure. And some of this, again, will be sort of echoed or previously by our experts today. So feedback is really about being timely, isn't it? So making sure that we're giving feedback while the details are still fresh with our students. And really that's also bound by our roughly sort of 3-week turnaround time for feedback as well at Charles Sturt. Trying to be clear in our feedback. So it's really important to try to be unambiguous in our communication with students. And this might sound like a no-brainer, but actually putting our beginner hats on, sometimes it's really thinking about, well, this is the language I'm using. Will my language be understandable to students? So really making sure that what we say is clear and concise. So I think we can all remember having assignments perhaps returned to us with things like good work or maybe unclear, or the dreaded red cross in pen next to something, but you weren't quite sure what that was referring to. So really being quite explicit and clear. Making sure that we can be educative and not just evaluative in our assessments. Sometimes if we're, under a pile of marking, it's easy to do the evaluative type of feedback to students, but that's quite quick and easy. But the educative part is even more important. It does take a little bit of time. So if something is incorrect, perhaps explaining what is correct, what would be the correct way of a student doing something, or a more correct way of doing something. So far more valuable to focus on strengthening the students' work in these types of processes. Also thinking about how we can be proportionate to the criteria or the goals of the assignment. So perhaps thinking about how and where we spend our time in providing feedback on specific elements of the assignment. So going back to our rubric, seeing what was perhaps worth more of a percentage or more marks within the assignment, and perhaps that's where we put our effort and our feedback. Again, everyone has different types of assessments and rubrics, so some of this will work for some instances, and at other times perhaps not. Thanks, LK. Some of our next ones just around locating student performance. So this is again is in relation to the goals of the task. So making sure that we can feed forward, emphasize where the students did really well, where they could work on productively for the future. So making sure there's some element they can take with them in that scaffolding process into the next assessment, perhaps in your subject or another subject they might be studying. A couple more just to thinking around emphasizing the task performance. And I think most of us tend to do this, and rubrics help us, I think, stay on track in these types of instances. So focusing on the task rather than the attributes or of the learner or of the self of the person. Making sure that we're phrasing our feedback in that ongoing dialogue. Rather than just an endpoint. So I think when we think about feedback as that sort of reciprocal type of communication, that backward and forward, I think all of our experts today sort of demonstrated that really nicely, that there is this very again, reciprocal relationship, that nature of giving and taking between two people. So making sure it's not the end point, and then there's an opening for students to come and talk to you further about that feedback. And I think the final one, it's at the end here, but it's really quite important. And we talked about this, each of us a little bit as well, but making sure we're sensitive to the individual. So feedback, it should really reflect, I guess, the individual student's sort of context, making sure that, there's little things that we can do. So when we name the student, so, thank you, Lachlan, for your assignment, or this, Lachlan, this is some feedback on your assignment here. So when we name someone, that's really quite powerful, but also when we talk to them in a way that's really quite understanding and showing empathy as well around how we're providing this feedback. So I'm sure, going back to that very first question we posed at the beginning of, have you ever received feedback you didn't know what to do with? Just thinking about how we felt with that feedback and how we can take that into feedback with our students. Yes, absolutely, Lachlan. We won't be, students are more than just a number. We won't be calling them by their student number. So thank you. I think, now I think maybe these were some of Kim's feedback, I think perhaps from last time, but making sure that our feedback is consistent. Kim, was this your feedback here that we had on the screen? Did you want to talk to this one quickly? Or if I put you on the spot?
No, that's okay. Yeah, that was just something that I had picked up along the way in terms of things that made giving feedback a lot easier, and which is definitely working for me and and has become quite true. I think the first thing is actually do your assessment task. Not many academics do that, I've noticed, and it's because we're often frequently time compressed, but unless you've actually undertaken the assessment task yourself, running assessment drop-in sessions, which is what we do in law before the assessment's due to try and scaffold preparation for assessment, is fairly abstract and irrelevant if you haven't actually attempted it yourself. So what you'll pick up when you do something like this, when you're writing an answer guide, is whether the task you've set is meeting the criteria, also whether it's achievable in the word count that you've set on it, and whether there are alternate resources that you're expecting students to go to that they might not be just in their prescribed readings, for example, or where there's helpful information. So the other bonus is that you're giving your markers an exemplar, and you can also publish that later on to your students of, well, here's my answer to the assessment task. So that's another way that you can give really good feedback to students. I know it's time consuming, but I do think it's really worth it. And I think too, Kirsten had indicated this, obviously that's what's going on in your org site, which is great, but we bookend in our moderation, we mark papers of students we know are at different levels, and we share that with our markers to make sure everyone's on the same page and they see the level of expectation that we have in terms of the feedback and the type of feedback that we're giving students. And having assessment drop-in sessions as well, we found gives you a very valuable opportunity to be thinking about how you shape assessment. So the feedback comes back to you as well as helping the student as scaffolding them in preparation. So do think about hosting a very short lunchtime, just-in-time drop-in session online with your students. Not compulsory, it's not a tutorial. I'll talk for 10 minutes and then you can ask me anything you want. You can drop in within this hour at any point in time and drop out again. And students really like that. We've had really positive feedback from that.
Probably one of those things as well where it's right at the 11th hour as well, if it's timely and happening at the point when you know they're all thinking about the task and doing it, rather than, I suppose, ideally when you wanted them to be thinking about it and doing it, then that attendance and the type of questions coming in are going to be more on point, I would assume.
Yeah, excellent tips, Kim. And I think we've had some tips also coming through sort of the chat bots throughout today's session as well around what people have been trialing and using. And I think each of us, so each of the people here today have really shown, I guess, the strength in trial and error and trying things and then seeing what's worked and what doesn't, and then that evolving as we keep going on teaching with our students in our subjects. So some really great examples here. I wonder if I should wrap it up really quickly. Okay, we're 1 past 11. So of course we've gone overtime today, but all for good reason. So we might just wrap it up there, I think. But thank you everyone for coming along. Thank you to our special guests, Kim, Kirsten and Wouter. Thank you very much, Lachlan, for your work and your support today. Thank you everyone for coming along, and I hope you have a really fantastic Tuesday. Thank you very much.
Thanks everyone.